Designed to free you from the four walls of today for a half hour of high adventure.
So first of all, a huge thank you to you for checking this out. Philosophobia is a podcast designed to make philosophy fun. Every week, I'm going to be interviewing a different philosopher about a hot topic in philosophy. Along with me, I'll bring a guest, the philosophobe, who will know nothing about the topic, nor anything about philosophy. Perhaps they're even skeptical about philosophy as a subject. They're going to make sure that things stay interesting and the basic questions are never overlooked. If successful, the philosophobe will be cured of their philosophophobia, you'll be entertained, and everyone will know a little bit more about philosophy. In this episode, we're going to be talking about editing human beings. Is it wrong, for example, to change the DNA of future generations? Should we always strive to prevent disease, no matter what the consequences? And if you could make your child taller, stronger, and more good-looking, a bit like the Sims character creation screen, would you do it? And would this be a good thing for humanity? With me to answer all these questions is Dr. Christopher Gyngell, and I hope you enjoy. So we're here with Dr. Christopher Gyngell, who is Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellow within the Wahario Centre, which is where we are at now. I'm also here with Alec Fullerton. He's a very good friend of mine, who's a French student here at Oxford, just finished a year abroad. Mm-hmm. Did you have a good time, Alec?
It was brilliant. Had a very good time, yeah.
Any good stories?
Not for the podcast.
For the podcast, okay, brilliant. So, Christopher, could you just briefly tell us what genome editing is?
Yeah, of course. So, for around 2 decades now, scientists have been able to alter the genetic makeup of animals. So, as I was growing up, I'd often see on the news things of glow-in-the-dark mice and mice with ears growing out of their backs and all these types of crazy stuff. But essentially, how they were achieving those outcomes was this really messy method where they'd get a virus, they'd inject this animal with this virus, which would hopefully change the right type of genes in it. This was really imprecise. It was imprecise because in addition to maybe changing the genes or the genetic sequence that you're wanting to change, you change all these other types of genetic sequences. So only a few of the animals would get the right change. Furthermore, it was also often inefficient. So often it wouldn't even make the change that you wanted. So you needed large numbers of animals to do these experiments on. So it never really had much potential to be used in humans or to be used sort of in animals really precisely.
They didn't ever try it in humans.
They never tried it in humans. Far too dangerous. Well, there was a few. A few gene therapy
dodgy experiments.
Secret labs in Austria.
There were a few trials, and it was never really safe enough to get approved anyway for widespread human use. But what happened, starting around sort of 5 years ago, is they've designed this whole new range of techniques that can make precise and edited changes to DNA. Rather than using viruses, they use these engineered enzymes, which are found naturally in bacteria. What they found is that these enzymes that exist in bacteria, what they do is they're a defense mechanism that protects bacteria from viruses. So they've got a sort of guiding mechanism where that lets them to latch on to particular DNA sequences. And once they're latched on, they cut the DNA there. So it would basically cut the DNA sequence into these little fragments.
Is this the CRISPR system?
Yeah, so this is a CRISPR system.
So when was this introduced?
So this was first outlined in a paper in 2013 by Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel.
Still pretty new then.
Still
in the trial phase, presumably then.
So it's been used now in animals. It's been used, really, really widespread now. And
so what sort of potential does it have? Are there diseases which have the potential to be cured by this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we kind of talk about two distinct, especially for me, looking at the ethics, two distinct types of cures. So cures somatically, which is curing people who have a disease like HIV or like cancer, and is about altering their DNA in their bodies in a way that they're not going to pass to their children, which we call sort of somatic therapy. But there's also the potential to use these to alter what's called the human germline, which is the genes that we pass on to our children and pass on for generations. So with these technologies, there's the potential to get an embryo to identify that embryo might have the genes for cystic fibrosis, and to use this technology to correct those genes.
So one of the biggest questions that people have on this topic is obviously to do with designer babies, and whether, even though this is a sort of a preventative treatment that we're giving, it could sort of start a slippery slope argument for, like if you're going to make your offspring immune to Alzheimer's, then why not at the same time give them an enhanced metabolism, perfect eyesight, maybe increased height? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting philosophical question.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of debates about, well, if we could give someone enhanced eyesight, or if we could give them enhanced intellect, should we do it? I don't think it's clear that we shouldn't do it. And certainly there are really clever, well-known philosophers that argue we should. They argue that what's important is making changes that improve the well-being of children and that don't have these sort of...
When I think about it, my instant worry is that it would be the means with which we decide which babies to alter. So you'd have like the socio-economic impact of like, would we end up, because obviously this is a very labour-intensive, technologically demanding process, would we end up with a situation where only the wealthiest people would be able to design their babies, and you'd end up with a kind of dystopian like super class, and then do you know what I mean? Is that the for me the most crucial factor would be how you decide which embryos to alter.
Yeah. So, and this is a really common sort of concern about these technologies. Mostly people will respond in sort of the following way. The first is, well, if the main concern is just equality of this valuable resource, then it's really up to governments to make sure it's available to all. Right now we have really expensive cancer treatments that are only available to the rich. That's a bad thing. I think that's a bad thing. They should be available to all. But we don't see that as a reason not to develop the expensive cancer treatments just because they won't be available to all. And I guess, another sort of line I have with designer babies is I don't think it's clear that it's ethically wrong. I think it's an interesting issue, but I don't think we should let it distract from getting healthy babies. So it seems to me that there's no reason why, if we're concerned about these technologies being used for these enhancement-like purposes, we could just shape the regulation in such that, well, you're only allowed to use it for the prevention of disease.
So there's also a school of thought that having a random genetic makeup as a human is what gives us our autonomy. Do you have any opinions on that? Do you agree with that?
I don't agree with that. There's this...
That's what we want.
There's this sort of...
What's the thinking behind that?
So I think there's this concern from like Habermas that sort of has this to be, to really be free, to be autonomous, we have to have none of our nature, our DNA impacted by social forces. And that when you're talking about selecting genes and selecting DNA, that's sort of social forces. But I just deny.
Surely that's already affected if, say you have two women, they're both pregnant, one woman chooses to smoke.
Yeah.
That child's DNA has already been affected by a social cause. And would you say that because... And even not smoking is a social effect that's going to have. So, do you know what I mean?
So this is my kind of response. I think our DNA is already, our DNA makeup is the product of social forces. We've been having, joint social cultural evolution for generations, and to think that our DNA is just the product of this random nature and not the product of the society we live in, I think is just a sort of an ignorant kind of view.
Would this not be a sort of more mass scale situation there, where you're affecting millions of genomes at the same time? As a parent having sort of a decision to do something inadvertently with their own child.
And I really just think it becomes on what type of choices that we are sort of making. And when it comes down to essentially the prevention of disease, and, I just don't think, I think it's very hard to run the argument that if someone's got a predisposition to cystic fibrosis or Parkinson's, in some way they're more autonomous than if they had that disease cured. Disease limits your options. It limits what you can choose to do with your life. But that's not to say that there aren't these concerns. I mean, if there was this, I think there are concerns about this being this mass-produced way, like you said, that if everyone had free reign and could choose anything for their children, what type of choices would they make? And I think there are concerns about sort of genetic diversity and genetic diversity for particular traits. So,
are there any areas in the world where scientists are looking into genome editing in a way to enhance the human condition as opposed to just preventing disease?
Not really, no. I mean, not that I know of. And this is mainly a result, I think, about, also how scientists get funding kind of thing. I mean, scientists, if they want to say, I want to investigate the genetics of, a disease, then they're more likely to get funding, and they say, well, I just, looking at the genetics of enhancement kind of thing. So I think right now it is, we certainly know more about the genetics of diseases than we do about the genetics of non-disease traits like intelligence and things.
You can never be sure, though, that sort of isolated governments that we don't really know a lot about, and whose motives we might question. I mean, who's to say that, as well as developing nuclear weapons, North Korea aren't also looking into developing? I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but it's super army. It sounds like silly, but
it's
kind of scary. What if, 20 years time, these enormous super soldiers come out of North Korea? Let's hope not. But
that's a really good point. And there are actually,
and I mean, so if we go I don't know if it's definitely the right thing, but sort of Hitler and eugenics, is that kind of, was he looking at that sort of genetic editing? Or at least more of a sort of, I don't know,
biological something.
So
selective.
Again, eugenics is another sort of common
it's kind of fancy though, it was straying into.
Well, there's just lots of wrong with eugenics. As my ethicist hat, if you look about what happened in the eugenics program, and you're talking about forced sterilization, mass murder, I don't have to work very hard to show you why that's wrong. Regardless of what they were trying to do.
That's kind of a given, right?
Yeah.
So something I was talking to Steve earlier when we were coming down today. So it's a bit of a gloomy outlook to have, but say if we're talking about preventing diseases and potentially stopping things that kind of cause aging as we know it, like sort of Alzheimer's, like sort of organ failure as people get older, things we could combat. An obvious repercussion of this would be, less people die and they live longer. So obviously we're going to cause overpopulation potentially. Which take a simplistic point of view, it's obviously a positive thing that people are living longer and aren't succumbing to diseases that we can help stop, but equally this will inevitably put a massive strain on infrastructure, government, what do you think about, is that something that has to be taken into account?
So I think there's two kind of interesting questions. So the first one is just a purely philosophical question. So say you've got two populations. There's one population where their members live for 100 years and then they die and they regenerate. And there's another population where they just don't die and they're just there and they're the population of immortals. Which of these two worlds do we kind of prefer? And I think we've got really strong worlds to prefer the one where they recycle. Yeah. And I think this
Why
is
for that?
I think it's to do with novelty.
More value having so much experience of the world and...
Well, I think that's right. I think that, once you get your mind set in a way, you can be less open to new ideas kind of thing and to new. And I think a population that regenerates is more adaptable and more variant. So this isn't a very important thing, but just think about music in these type of things, right? Think about what the culture of music would be. They'll be stuck in the music. Yeah, that'd be one way. But we get regeneration flow. We get these new sort of cultural sources and new sort of cultural novelty. It's also science. I think it's important to the progression of science. I can't remember the person who said this, but there was a famous scientist once said that, a new theory doesn't spread by convincing old people to change their minds, but by getting the new generation of scientists to adapt it. And I think there's something that's to be said about this sort of cycling sort of process. So I think I think that's an interesting world. But I think what we can aim for these technologies is not just extending life, but rather what's called compressing mobility. So that is like stopping. Basically you can live healthily until 80 or 90 and then sort of die, have a rapid decline.
And this isn't a problem.
Why would you then, what would cause the death at the end?
Well,
Don't your
so, I
cells,
mean, I
after
don't know.
cells have multiplied a certain number of times, don't they then, like, they...
Is that an issue to do with the genome? The cells like
So I think you'd have to, I think, so right now, so one of the things that is sort of influences aging is like telomere length, which is the length. So every time your cells copy, they sort of like lose a little bit. And I think, that represents some sort of biological limit for how many times your cells can redivide. So I think, I think those problems are potentially can be overcome by genome editing, but the question is it the same sort of genome editing that just is saying, well, we want to make sure people are resistant to heart disease and cancer, or is it sort of another sort of research paradigm? I actually don't know off the top of my head, but I think from my thing, we should be aiming for a world where you don't suffer from disease, you can live healthily to old age, but then maybe...
It seems like people get carried away. Like when we're talking about this topic, I've done it right now, but talking about this topic, we're kind of taking what sort of scientists like you are actually doing and actually looking at, and then like sort of massively expanding on it with these sort of doom-mongering fantasies, which actually are kind of withdrawing from the benefits of what people are doing.
From philosophy,
it's kind of, I don't know, like the idea of preventing diseases is actually quite
a noble
simple
cause,
and like really good. So why is everyone questioning it with like, you're gonna make crazy like monster babies like you?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head, and that's sort of one of the challenges for me.
It must be frustrating for you having to talk about it.
It kind of is, but people want to talk about it because it's interesting. They're really interesting kind of problems. But we're in the practical situation today are these really young technologies that could be used to do these really simple sort of things, and currently they're illegal in most of the world. Well, so clinically they're illegal in in most Western sort of countries. But even research using them, so even using them in petri dishes, just to study development, is illegal in sort of most of Europe.
There have been issues to do with IVF for many years now, haven't there? The sort of discarded embryos and people who are pro-life and stuff. Yeah. Is that an issue which is more prevalent with genome editing?
Well, it isn't. And it's not. So one sort of advantage, you might say, of gene editing. So right now we use IVF and PGD to avoid diseases like cystic fibrosis. So they create a range of embryos. They select the ones that don't have the disease-causing genes, and then they discard the other ones.
What's the sort of success rate there? What the selected to the unselected?
I mean, pro-lifers aren't going to like that.
So I think and this is one of the things, I'm not sure there's that good data, but I mean, the average IVF cycle produces around 7 embryos. And if you're, selecting for, say, cystic fibrosis, where you both cover, so, roughly 3/4 of them won't have a quarter of them will be completely free of the disease, half of them will be carriers, and a quarter of them will have the disease. So you're talking about, I guess, 3 that might be fine.
Is that for IVF or for gene editing?
So that's for IVF.
For IVF. Okay.
So with gene editing, there's at least the potential that you could just create one embryo and just edit that embryo, and you wouldn't have any of these.
But there are also these off-target mutations, aren't there?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that scientists are a bit unsure about. Will it ever? So you couldn't do it now, and the technology is really young, as we were saying earlier, and it's only been used in human embryos, 3 or 4 times. So it's unclear, but you couldn't do it now. But potentially, you'd have a really precise, effective technology that you could use once. But the other way that you might be able to do this without using embryos at all is that, rather than just using this technology to edit the DNA in embryos, you could use it to edit the DNA in gametes, so in sperm or in oocytes. I think the most exciting way that this might get going, the relatively new term, is what you can do is you can get a male, you get them to do an operation where they remove their what's called their sort of sperm stem cells that are in their testes.
Oh, wow.
And you can sort of alter them. You might be able to alter them, then put them back in, and then they produce these sort of altered sperm for the rest of their
super sperm.
The rest of their life. Yeah. And that way, you could use that to, alter any disease-causing genes that a male might have, put them back in, and then
it's quite invasive.
Do it that way. But it's one-off. Yeah, but it's it's one-off.
That's
just like
the other thing I want to talk about is you mentioned in your paper that there are some genes that provide protection against some diseases, but then increase the susceptibility to others. So you mentioned, is it malaria and then HIV?
HIV, yeah.
Is this something which is common, or is this?
Yeah.
Is there usually sort of the yin and yang?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm not. There's certainly like a number of genes where they've found it. So it's not just the I forget the name of the gene, but there's one that's malaria and HIV, and I think there's a few others, these immune genes where there's. So
it will help protect against malaria, but would also increase the chance of you developing HIV.
Yeah,
so that's quite a difficult ethical dilemma, I suppose.
So this is one of the concerns, that if this was like this mass marketed thing, that say everyone had the opportunity, and say HIV was in the news a lot, which constantly is. You might get a lot of people in the UK, a lot of parents say, "Oh, I want the HIV resistant sort of child," and say if everyone did that, then it might not be malaria necessarily, but there could be a new disease that we're not sure about, and hey, all of a sudden that we don't have any resistance for this sort of thing, and it comes through. I
mean, if you had to pick one of the two, though, I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of both diseases, but it seems like I'd rather have malaria out of the two, because that's far more effectively treated. Yeah. And like, I mean, it's less.
It depends where you are geographically as well, I suppose so, yeah.
Well, I mean, living here, I'd much rather be more susceptible to catching malaria. Yeah, I mean, certainly. It doesn't really exist here, maybe.
Yeah. And I think the question is just there's going to be some areas of the genome, though, that we want diversity in a population. So it's just makes good sense for as a population to have diversity in these genes. So no matter what sort of pathogen might strike, you'll have some people that are sort of resistant to it, and some people that are sort of not resistant.
Do you think that we have the authority to make these decisions on behalf of future generations?
Well, I really think the question now is, well, we need to do research, and particularly these type of things. So we need to, not just speak in the abstract about should we use it or should we use it. We need to use it. Should we use it on this particular mutation that's got this effect and this effect, and this particular mutation and this effect and this effect? And I think there are certainly some mutations where it looks like we would lose nothing by getting rid of them from the gene pool. So there's a disease called Tay-Sachs disease, which is a really, really devastating disease. Basically, a child will develop normally for 6 months, and then they'll start to slowly deteriorate. They'll go blind, deaf, paralytic, and death occurs at age sort of 4. Now, they've also done studies that, well, maybe there's a sort of what's called a heterozygous advantage. So maybe people who have one copy of this gene but not both might be beneficial in some way. And so far, there's very little evidence for any heterozygous advantage. It looks like it's just a bad luck that a population, this random mutation happened. It was a small population, and then it spread.
So that's something we can be sure about to quite a high level of accuracy.
Yeah, I think so. And that. I've got no qualm saying, well, we should just take that gene out of that mutation out of our gene pool. Yeah. But for some of these malaria HIV ones, maybe it's more complicated. Maybe we need to look at it, in more detail.
It'd be interesting as well to speculate about how these changes might be implemented. Sort of, are we talking universal, like sort of? But I mean, if it was we picked a change that we're pretty confident was a good thing, and the NHS could do it affordably, whatever, have this scenario, would it be applied universally to every newborn child? And then you might have children in Great Britain would have this thing that like children in a different part of the world might not have, and it will come down to governments and allocation of spending in science funding and whatnot. What do you think about that? Like the actual practical implementation of...
Yeah, so I think it's a really, and again, I think that's a really interesting sort of question. And it would seem that because the cost of something like the NHS of treating genetic disease is so high, it seems
private thing.
Well, it costs so high. It puts such a strain on the system, which then takes resources away from other diseases. That you can conceive of a situation where the NHS say, okay, everyone newborn, you get screened, and if you've got these disease-carrying genes, we offer you an incentive to like get them corrected, so you don't pass them on. And, it does raise these really interesting questions about sort of coercion and sort of and things like that. But, I think, I think it's plausible, like we do for other public health, public health initiatives where we try and like improve the health of future generations, that could be ethically permissible. As he said, you'd again this weird situation where it will be happening in some parts of the world and not others, and that's a really complex problem, and we face that in lots of other sort of areas too. So it's just climate change and things like that.
Like question of development as well. I mean, like sort of there are lots of poor countries that can't afford to like sort of introduce sustainable energy and whatnot, and they just literally need to keep burning fossil fuels because they just can't afford it. It's going to be interesting implications for that. Inequality and whatnot.
So what's the sort of current picture with genome editing now? Is it just a purely research based tool?
So it's been really, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, a really interesting paper came out from the US, which was the first one to gene edit embryos in the US. So before this point, it had been done in China a few times, and basically it was interesting research, but there were a lot of what's called off-target mutations, which sort of suggested that, clinical applications are really a long way away. The US study did it in quite a good lab, and they found they did it really quite successfully with no evidence of off-target mutations. And now people are, taking it seriously. It's like, oh, maybe we could clinically use this, like in the not too distant future. I think.
Are there still significant legal barriers to doing it though? Or have they been sort of alleviated at all recently?
So it's the main legal thing. So a lot of countries just won't have laws that sort of govern it. So
did you say UNESCO had something to do with that?
Yeah, UNESCO had banned all research, hadn't they?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the
what on earth? I thought UNESCO were about World Heritage.
Yeah, I'm not sure what authority UNESCO have.
What on earth do they do?
Maybe they just mentioned it.
They mentioned it. Yeah, the UNESCO had this. I thought was a really silly statement saying that any gene editing embryos is eugenics and it should be it was this really.
It's going to be a huge backlash from UNESCO.
No, I've just got that part.
I refer to them in my paper. They can read my papers. I criticise them in some
we use a code.
Essentially, the US, it's really unclear legal situation. They don't have any federal guidelines that would make it sort of illegal. They seem to have these weird things where if they were trying to sell it, the FDA would have regulations, and
it's supposed to be different in different states.
It's different in different states. So I don't think there's a really clear picture about the US.
And of course, where would ensure America's a quite a unique situation in terms of obviously private healthcare, and in healthcare insurance would some plans might offer screening and potential editing, others wouldn't. That's another another. Whereas Australia's got similar to the NHS kind of style thing, right? So that's more sort of. We've still got private hospitals and whatnot, but
it's like another sort of layer of complexity. So I think the UK's got the best regulations for now, where they allow research. You can do research up to 14 days, but reproductive applications are banned. I think we need to do a lot more research before we really take reproductive situations seriously, and you can do that in the UK. I think the legal situation in, say, most of Europe and in Australia and Canada is kind of the worst, because they just you can't do any research with it. You can't do research, say, with sperm cells, which I think is really silly, because sperm, let's face it, they die all the time. For pointless reasons. We could be trying to, cure diseases using them, but it's completely illegal. So,
so the outcome of the paper was that there's more research being done. Is that what you said?
Of the
it's a good step
the outcome
forward.
of the paper is that it's a really good step forward. It seems like if you devote research time to this, the CRISPR technology will eventually be accurate enough and precise enough to be able to be used on human embryos.
You can guarantee there'll be no off-target mutations.
You can seem to be able to guarantee, So
is there a risk with even sort of on-target mutations, but which are actually off-target mutations, but you just haven't done the calculations correctly?
Yeah, so some scientists are skeptical. They say, well, maybe they haven't checked for off-target mutations in the right way, and if you just
never really know until you did it, would you?
No. But the other thing to say about off-target mutations is that if it's a sort of small amount, it's unclear how much we should worry, because we know that just other things that we accept increase the amount of random germline mutations we pass on to our children. So we know that older fathers pass on a much higher rate of random mutations than children. We know that
Smoking.
Yeah, exactly. Smoking is another one.
Yeah.
You
I imagine smoking probably do a lot more damage than like a generally positive scientific endeavour would.
Yeah,
like,
well,
I mean, like the number of random chemicals at play in in cigarette smoke.
Yeah,
It's got to be doing some kind of bad things, right?
Yeah.
But,
so yeah, I think that's right. So I mean, I think the ultimate question shouldn't be, can we guarantee there's absolutely no off-target mutations, or can we just guarantee that they're in this sort of acceptable range that
how in the next 10 years, how far do you think we're going to come, or what's the next step like?
Yeah, I think, given that this technology was first, just described 4 years ago, I think in 10 years...
It's actually so young. Like that's,
Look, I think in 10 years, let's go away from the human case for instance. I think in 10 years, we're going to be eating food that's gene edited. I think there's going to be somatic treatments. I think there'll be cancer treatments where they gene edit your immune cells to attack cancer cells. I think our livestock will be gene edited. I think our pets could be gene edited. And I think...
In a designer sense or in a sort of preventative
maybe a health sense. I think they're already talking... Well, they're talking about now...
Steer clear of the design.
Yeah. Well, they're talking about...
Muddies the waters.
They're talking about now, like, dog breeds and stuff, that these purebreds and they've got these genetic deformities. Like, shepherds have funny backs and stuff. And they're saying, we could just...
Pugs.
Pugs,
have,
sausage dogs as well. The back, the lumbar.
Yeah,
the lumbar.
It's a real.
Is that a technical term?
Yeah, well, the lumbar is the lower back. It's a real issue. Yeah.
Sorry.
You have to get ramps for. I looked into
Sausage
getting a
ramps.
sausage dog. They if they have to jump up onto things, they can hurt their back. So you get a ramp.
Right.
And buy sausage dog.
So you may be able to, you'll have sausage dogs without ramps in 10 years. Possibly you'll be able to.
We can dream.
Take the sausage out the dog.
Yeah, and I think about that stage, there's going to be pressure to start to change the laws around the world that you can start to do this for the prevention of disease.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Christopher. And thank you very much,
Thank you.
Alex.
It's really
Thanks.
interesting.
Yeah, it's great to meet you.
Thanks a lot.